What's up, guys? This is Taking the Field with Stevie Mac, episode 39 of the podcast, and on this episode, we're going to talk about the PLL head coach power rankings, and I took to Twitter yesterday, at Stevie Mac Media is my Twitter handle. I took to Twitter to ask you guys what your thoughts were on the power rankings and to give me your lists for your power rankings that you have, and I got a bunch of different responses for those, and so I started compiling a list of kind of the consensus in terms of 1 through 7, and what I found was that our lists were actually exactly identical when all was said and done. So we're going to run through all 7 rankings right here and right now. So starting it all off at number 1, to probably no one's surprise, is Whipsnake's head coach Jim Stagnitas. So Stagnita's a 2-time PLL champion now, both in 2019 and 2020, with an overall head coaching record with the Whipsnakes of 14-4. And for me, I think the Whipsnakes are really what I'd consider to be the gold standard for pro field lacrosse. And I know that Ben Rubior, when he came to the Atlas, said that he wants to be the Bill Belichick of pro lacrosse, but I think that you got to give it to Jim Stagnita hands down here, because I mean, when you go back and look at it, they lost the most players to the expansion draft to the Water Dogs, and they somehow found a way to get better. Think about that. They got better than how good they were a year ago. They lost Drew Snyder. They lost Ryan Drenner. They lost Connor Kelly. They got better. They added Zed Williams. Brad Smith came off an injury that sat him out all of 2019. They had Jay Carlson sitting there. They traded for Max Tuttle. This team lost all those guys that I mentioned a second ago, and they found a way. So number 2 on the list is Redwoods head coach Nat St. Laurent. After a championship game appearance in 2019, they did go 5-5 in that regular season. They went 2-2 in pool play during 2020, even though they had a depleted defense and they were playing without probably one of their better offensive players in Jules Henningberg. And really, I think that he's proven to be able to identify talent during the drafts, whether it be entry draft or collegiate draft. I mean, he went out this offseason in the 2 drafts and addressed the face-off position there, had a little bit of trouble with that early on in the championship series, but they slowly kind of found their groove as we went along. And then even just looking at that 2019 collegiate draft he had, including guys like Tim Troutner, Tyler Dunn, and Brendan Gleason all coming in that one draft. And I think he really kind of gets the most out of the players that he's working with. You saw it in the second half of 2019, and you saw it in 2020 as well when they got off to a bit of a rough start, and they kind of turned it around there in the second half as well. But I think for me, the knock against him being this high is that his overall record, including the playoffs through the first 2 years in the PLL, is only 10-9. But the third guy on this list that I'll get to right now is really not a whole lot better in terms of an overall record, but I think you sometimes have to look past the overall record to see really the kind of impact that some of these coaches really have on their squads. So number 3 is Andy Towers of the Chaos. So they were regular season champs in 2019 with a 7-3 record, and they made a championship game appearance, as we all know, here in 2020, but they did start out pool play 0-4, but after benching Connor Fields, the offense really seemed to open up a lot more, and the ball just kind of seemed to ping around the field left and right, and they started running up the score a little bit, especially there in a couple of those playoff games that they had against the Archers and the Chrome, I believe it was. And I think a lot of people really just love the kind of intensity and motivation that a guy like Andy Towers brings to that Chaos sideline. So he sits right there at number 3. Number 4 is Archers head coach Chris Bates. So the Archers were an average club in 2019, but they did have one of the top defenses in the league. And rookie attackman Grant Ament this year seemed to kind of put their offense over the top. Here in 2020, he had 6 goals and 14 assists, as I mentioned on a previous episode when I spoke with Phil Rothermick, known as PLL Updates. And I think Bates, just like Nat St. Laurent and Andy Towers, their record won't really jump off the page at you, but he is, I think, considered a top-tier coach here in the PLL because of, again, just like I said with Nat St. Laurent, he kind of gets the most out of the team that he has. So number 5 is going to be Chrome head coach Tim Sudan, and this was his first year here in the PLL with the Chrome Lacrosse Club, and he really overhauled this roster to the point where it seemed like no one from that 2019 roster was really safe this offseason. But after all was said and done, he did assemble a team that made the Chrome a winner here in 2020. They were only 3-2 during the championship series, but this coming off a team in 2019 that won 2 out of 10 games in that 2019 regular season. So I think for Sudan, the biggest thing for them is to just continue building off the momentum that they started here in 2020 and build more towards 2021, especially with that loaded collegiate draft coming up next spring, which again, we've talked about that on past episodes here on Taking the Field with Stevie Mack as well, excuse me. Number 6 on the list is Water Dogs head coach Andy Copeland. So the Water Dogs, as we all know, were the expansion club in 2020 for the PLL, and they were assembled basically from a team of guys that the other 6 clubs kind of just tossed away on their rosters. And I think that we saw a lot of good from them, especially early on against the Atlas in their first game. But we saw a lot of good things across the field from a lot of their different positions at attack. You had guys like Kieran McCardle played really well during the championship series. In the midfield, anytime you have a guy like Connor Kelly on your midfield unit, you know you're going to be in pretty good shape. And I think even at faceoff, you saw it in that first half against the Atlas with Jake Withers going up against Trevor Baptiste. They do have a lot of solid pieces already on this roster, but just like I said with Tim Sudan, I think they need to just continue building this roster to where they want it to be, and I think that this 2021 off season will go a long way towards doing that. And then rounding out my power rankings for PLL head coaches was Ben Rubior, the Atlas head coach. So to me, Rubior took an average team in 2019 as the Atlas went 5-5 in 2019, and he almost seemed to make them worse, it looks like, from if you go back and watch some of their games from this past championship series. And to me, the biggest thing was that he made a lot of what I would consider head-scratching personnel decisions during the championship series, and one of the biggest ones, which I highlighted here on the podcast a few episodes ago, was the decision to make Joel Tinney a short stick D mid exclusively. So he does have guys like Kevin Unterstein and Jake Richard already on the roster as short stick D mids, and they're seen as 2 of the top short stick D mids in pro lacrosse. And then you bring in a guy like Jeremy Thompson off waivers who can also act as a third rotation guy as a short stick D mid. So I get that you wanted to use Tinney as a short stick D mid in certain situations, but I said on the podcast previously that I thought he could have been a lot more of a two-way mid, which is what they did with Brian Costabile. So, but I mean, you saw the impact that not having a guy like Joel Tinney on offense had for this Atlas offense. You go back to last year, Tinney was the number 4 assist leader on the Atlas behind Kieran McCardle, who's now with the Water Dogs, then Eric Law and Rob Pinnell. And I think, like I said, you saw his absence on the field for the Atlas in 2020 from an offensive standpoint, because their midfielders really had no ability to create separation off dodges from up top. And I think that having a guy like Tinney out there who can move the ball around and dodge to feed, which he was one of the top dodge to feed midfielders in 2019, that really the ball seemed to kind of stick at X a lot with guys like Rob Pinnell. And I think that when you have a guy like Tinney, he has the ability to open up the field a little bit more and kind of spread the ball around wherever necessary. So for me, Ben Rubior checks in at number 7 due to the fact that he took an Atlas team that really wasn't horrible to watch in 2019 and almost seemed to make them kind of unwatchable at times during that 2020 championship series. So that'll do it for episode 39 of the podcast. Make sure to check out all past episodes of the podcast on YouTube, SoundCloud, Podchaser, Spotify, Anchor, and at taking-the-field.com. That's my main host website for the podcast, but that'll do it for this one. I'll talk to you guys later.